I'm most fortunate to have the opportunity to interview Professor Philippe Sands, QC, following his extraordinary appearance at the 2022 annual Seamus Heaney lecture, which is hosted by the University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies. Philippe is an internationally distinguished barrister and legal scholar, an award-winning writer and current president of English PEN, one of the world's oldest human rights organisations, which champions the universal freedoms to write and to read. Philippe has contributed to the Financial Times, The Guardian, the New York Review of Books and Vanity Fair. His book, The Rat Line, has been produced as a podcast by the BBC and France Culture. Philippe is also a member of the board of the Hay Festival. Philippe, welcome back to the University of Liverpool, albeit remotely, and very many thanks for agreeing to speak to me today.
Wonderful to be back at the University of Liverpool. I wish it was in person. That was an incredibly significant visit for me. I had an amazing evening there. What an amazing group of people you brought together.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And I wonder if we might begin by talking about the lecture itself, because when we spoke about the possibility of this interview, you very generously said how much you'd welcome the chance to reflect on the evening. And I was doing so myself in advance of today. And it was, the atmosphere, I think, was unlike anything I've ever experienced in a lecture context. There were several hundred people in the audience of all ages and backgrounds. And as far as I was aware, every one of us, from the moment that you stood up to speak, was sort of riveted in place. And Justine Mitchell, of course, set the tone so well with that first reading of Seamus Heaney's poem From the Republic of Conscience. But I wonder, what it was like for you to give the lecture that you gave that evening in the presence of all of those people, but perhaps specifically in the presence of Seamus Heaney's own family.
Well, it was very special. I chose as my subject a book that I've just completed and published a few months ago in September, called The Last Colony, which is the tale of a place called Chagos, located in the Indian Ocean, was part of the British colony of Mauritius for about 150 years until 1865, when it was separated and a new colony was created, the British Indian Ocean Territory, and the entire population forcibly deported. It's a terrible story, and I've been involved closely in it for about 12 years, working as a lawyer for the government of Mauritius, which is trying to recover its islands and has made actually pretty significant progress in doing that. But it's also a very human story. And that was the bit that I really wanted to share. A remarkable lady called Lisby Elise, who was one of the people who was deported. Part of the reason I think that I wanted to talk about this subject in the context of Liverpool University's annual Heaney lecture was the resonance with aspects of life in Ireland, which are so deeply embedded in the work of Seamus Heaney. I've, of course, like many people, been very familiar with his poetry for many years. But being invited to give the lecture, which was an incredible honor, because I do just think of myself mainly as a sort of jobbing lawyer and occasional writer, this was a connection really with someone who so many of us hold in such high esteem because of his great humanity and his capacity to conjure up and open the imagination with words. I think he's a very special person. And he's a very special person in part because he occupies a space in a geographic sense that is also riven with conflict. So I was thrilled to get the invitation. I was even more thrilled when I learned that there was a wonderful Irish actor, Justine, who would read 5 poems. We had great fun choosing the 5 poems. I can say a bit more about that in a moment. But even more thrilled when I learnt that members of Seamus Heaney's family were going to be there. And I have to be very honest, I completely fell in love with them. I'd known Catherine a little. I'd met her on a couple of occasions in London. We sat opposite each other at a dinner at the Royal Literary Society, and she was wonderful. She's a wonderful person, really smart, really interesting, really funny, and I liked her hugely, and I liked every member of the family. So for me, it was a very special evening. I think because it brought together the worlds of law and politics and literature and words and ideas. And it had a spirit for me. I've been in touch with the Heaneys ever since. I'm sort of hoping they'll adopt me. I want to be a member of the Heaney family. I declare that publicly for the whole world to know.
That's so wonderful. I think every member of staff at the Institute of Irish Studies feels the same, and it's an extraordinary honour for us to have them come to visit us and spend time with us once a year, as they do around the time of the lecture. I'm so pleased you mentioned Lisby at this moment so early on in the lecture. Lisby Elysée, who is at the heart of the lecture that you gave, who is at the heart of the book and the story that you tell. During the lecture, you screen the testimony she gave to the International Court of Justice towards the beginning, and then at the end, that footage of her return in the company of friends and family to the island of her birth. And I'm sure I wasn't the only person in the audience that evening who was very nearly moved to tears in watching those two pieces of film. And I wonder if you could say, because you're so closely connected with so many people, so many Chagossians, and have become so across the time that you've been working on their behalf, what was it about Lisby that seemed to you so central to the story that you were going to tell, she herself, I suppose?
Well, the case that eventually went to the International Court of Justice was a request from the General Assembly of the United Nations to the International Court to ask whether the decolonization of Mauritius had been completed. There was a basic rule in international law that began at some point in the 1960s, was that when the colonial power gave independence to one of its colonies, it couldn't chop off part of the colony and keep it unless it had obtained the consent of the most affected population. And the British went out of their way to stop that population from giving its consent. And indeed, the 2,000 people on the Chagos archipelago, who were pretty much not even treated as human beings, were not asked ever to give their consent. One of those people was Lisby Elysée. And when we were preparing the phase of the case for the presentation of our arguments before the judges at the court, we determined pretty early on that it was really important that the judges should hear directly from a Chagossian, from someone who'd been there, from someone who'd been forcibly deported. Why? Because in 1965 and then between 68 and 73, when they were removed from their homes, their voices were not heard. So we could not replicate that. So we went through this process of identifying one of the many Chagossians who could have given testimony. And eventually we settled on the remarkable Lisby Elysée. She was 20 in 1973. And she told me the first time that I met her what had happened to her that day in April. It was the first time she'd ever seen white people on her island, or indeed anywhere. And she described how they told her, you will leave tomorrow and you will take one suitcase with you. And that resonated with me in part because of another book that I've written, East-West Street, which tells a number of stories, but one of the stories is my family's story and the story of my grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother, Amalia Flashner. And she was told the same thing in 1942. You're leaving tomorrow, one suitcase. And the moment that Lisby said that to me, it resonated. I felt that I was in the presence of a great-grandmother, of course, I never met. Happily, Lisby's fate did not follow that of my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was exterminated. She was gassed at Treblinka. Lisby was deported to Mauritius. She lives now in a perfectly lovely home and has actually a pretty decent life. So fortunately, she didn't follow the same fate. But Liz became, for me, at a personal level, to embody a family that I never knew, and the story of which haunted my grandfather and my mother. And in a sense, while their details were perhaps not identical, the experience of a human being of being told that within 24 hours you will leave your home, you will take one suitcase with you, you will have no autonomy in terms of what will happen to you is appalling. It concentrates the mind. And yet, Lisby, the lady that I met and who gave such compelling testimony before the court, is a person of immense intelligence, of dignity, of fortitude, of courage. And she gave the most extraordinary testimony. She gave it in a pre-recorded form in a video. She can't read and she can't write. And that raised issues about her appearing in person. The court generously allowed her to present by way of a pre-recorded video. And it was an enormously powerful moment. She spoke for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, and I think it transformed the case. She embodied the human element that's sort of across the writing of Seamus Heaney, and the human element that's across the story of the Chagossians. And so she was very special for me. She was very special for the case. And at the lecture, I wanted people to understand who she was from her own words. So I played the testimony in full. I think it was very powerful. But I also played a short video of when she returned just a few months ago for the first time without an armed British guard to the island that was her home for 20 years. And I think that touched people very greatly. I think she's a very different person from me. She has a very different life. There are lots of issues about, a privileged white male writing the story of a not privileged black female. And somehow we found a way to do it. I was very careful to allow her always only to speak her own words. And the book opens and closes with her. And the lecture, in effect, opens and closes with her. She is the beating heart of that lecture. And she and her wonderful nephew, Olivier Boncoux, who's done a lot of the legal litigation, have been responsible for the successful outcome because it is their testimony and it's their efforts which have brought us to the cusp of justice. And that, I think, is a message that Seamus Heaney would have loved and would have appreciated.
Most certainly. And, in terms of humanizing the practice of law, I think Lisby Elysée, it is transformative in that sense as well. This is not, a stale clinical examination of facts and documents. This actually is life. These are people's lives, and that's the substance of what you work with. One of the things that I found so compelling about the lecture and what I find so compelling in the book is that Lisby, the long history of Chagos, their prisms through which to see so much of contemporary Britain and parts of the rest of the world, and very humorously, but also quite tragically, you gesture out to things like the lead up to and the fallout of Brexit, the kind of the pitiful calamity of Liz Truss's premiership, and most, I think, significantly and really terrifyingly, the apparent disregard of the rule of law that comes out of this history of Chagos. But you see them as symptoms of a much bigger problem, and each of those symptoms having a very damaging impact on Britain's international reputation in the past or across the past sort of 10 to 15 years or longer, depending on kind of how you look at it. And I was thinking about that dimension of the lecture and of the book, and I wonder, this issue of the disregard of the rule of law. I wonder if you see that as a product of a widespread distrust of expertise in Britain. One of the things I come back to as an academic who, hopefully across many years is developing a level of expertise in my subject, is that claim in and around 2016 that Britain is a country whose people has supposedly kind of had enough of experts. I mean, how do you think that this story does reveal something about the state of our nation in this moment?
I think it reveals a lot about the state of our nation. I think the trouble with experts, as Mr. Gove and others put it in 2016, is part of a much broader issue. In writing The Last Colony, and again, I think there's here a direct connection with the ideas of Seamus Heaney, I've come to realize that one of the difficulties that modern Britain faces is that it has simply not even begun to come to terms with its past. This is a country that looks at the past in rose-tinted spectacles, talks about the glorious days of colony and empire and a colossus astride the world, but cannot cope with being presented with the realities of what colony and empire meant for people like Lisby, Elise, and so many other people. I think it's one of the reasons why we are so obsessed in this country with Nazis. For example, I've experienced this with my last two books, East West Street and The Rat Line. Every newspaper in Britain approached me for interviews and conversations and this, that, and the other when I was writing about Nazis. They make us feel better about ourselves. The headline in the review of the Daily Telegraph for the book The Last Colony was, "The British are not Nazis." I don't claim that they are anywhere in the book. And there is this sense that our own horrors sort of pale in comparison to the horrors of others. And so we like to focus on the horrors of others and ignore our own. And we have completely ignored the realities of what we have done around the world and the realities of our very diminished state, which I think is just so obvious for everyone to see right now. An economy that is diminished, a body politic that is diminished, an authority around the world that is utterly diminished. The Chagos case tells that story. And continuing to live a life of delusion, imagining still that Britain is this extraordinarily important country around the world. It has many wonderful and excellent features, and in certain respects, culturally and otherwise, it remains a country that punches above its weight. But it has not begun to come to terms with its racism, its oppression, and the other horrors that it has perpetrated. And I think that's what we're seeing in this country today. That's really, frankly, what Brexit is about. It's a way of holding on to the illusion of this glorious past, that we can go it alone in the world. But of course, we've learned that we can't. We can't negotiate a single trade agreement of any significance. We can't negotiate political agreements. We can't negotiate anything because we are now a small country in the North Sea that is trying to make its way in an increasingly complex and turbulent world. So I think what The Last Colony shows is that we are not able to grapple with the demons of our past. And that was reflected in the fact that, many of the newspapers that covered the other books that I'd written just ignored anything to do with British colonial history, ignored anything to do with victims who happened to be Black. All the Chagossians are Black. What's the difference between the 2,000 people who live on the Falkland Islands and the 2,000 people who lived on Chagos? There's only one difference. It's the color of their skin. If the Chagossians had been white, none of this would have ever happened to them. And that's what we have not begun to come to terms with. And I think that is also a theme that Heaney explores, the Irishness and the sense of identity with another place that was also subject to British largesse, in which there was never a coming to terms with what Britain had done. And of course, in relation to the North and Northern Ireland, it is in effect still a colony. It was separated from Ireland in the 1920s. I gave a lecture the day after the Liverpool lecture in Dublin, and I said, people in Ireland may want to reflect on the story of Chagos because it's not so dissimilar to the story of Ireland, basically forcing a country to agree that a part of it will be dismembered. That's what the British do, but they don't want to take ownership of what they have done, not in a real sense. And that's what the last colony is really about.
I want to come in a moment to how those correspondences between former colonies, sort of still existent colonies, was explored so beautifully through the poetry that was read throughout the lecture. But just before I do that, I mean, one of the sort of facets of Seamus Heaney, which makes him so fascinating, important, influential, a writer, as far as I'm concerned, and many others would be concerned, is that training that he had as an educator, as a teacher, early on in his life, in his career. And education, your own education, was very significant in the lecture, and you provide an account of it, an even more detailed account of it in the last colony. And I'm thinking specifically in terms of the lecture of the Q&A that followed, when you connected your assessment of the state of the nation and how this story kind of reveals something to us about ourselves in this present moment, with the rediscovery of your old history textbook and the horrifying, I suppose, account of the so-called sunset on the empires. And I think, as an aside, the ways in which you analyse the language of that textbook suggests to literary critics, scholars of language like me, a kind of a lifetime of potential study. To sit and to read these textbooks, I think would be a very profitable and productive exercise. And it seemed to me that the textbook was another example, further evidence of a kind of intergenerational discord that many of us have become increasingly aware of over the past 5 to 10 years. The textbook might in some way explain or be an account for what we hope is a far less tolerant time from our own. But it also might explain why someone like Boris Johnson could say the things that he said about other peoples and cultures and nations, say the things that he said, write the things that he wrote, and has, and continues to write and say, and still find a receptive audience because, people were brought up on these textbooks that viewed other people and places and nations in a certain way, and that becomes kind of ingrained. And I can absolutely see that. But there is part of me that feels quite anxious about the idea of lending too much weight to a sense of that this is kind of an intergenerational thing, and actually as time passes these views might kind of fall away. And I'm worried about that because does that breed a kind of complacency? Do we risk kind of by being complacent threatening that future of hope and decency that you kind of look forward to at the end of the lecture? So I wonder, this is a sort of, a roundabout way of asking you how you think we should teach the history of colonialism and how you think as educators we should go about the decolonizing process.
So I'm really glad you've asked that question. I shared in the lecture and in the Q&A afterwards my sense of personal discomfort. How could it be that I, pretty well informed, engaged in matters of the world, had not come across, had not heard about the issues related to Chagos or other places? And I realized it must be something to do with my education. And in the book, I do talk about my university education and who taught me international law. These matters were never talked about. But I went back further and found in the attic a copy of my schoolboy history book. This Is Your Century by Geoffrey Treece. I think it was chapter 8 or thereabouts, Sunset on Empire, beginning with a comparison between Lord Mountbatten, magnificent specimen, and Mahatma Gandhi, less glamorous and magnificent specimen, at least in the view of that author, vegetarian, pacifist, and I'm paraphrasing, but these words are there, looks a bit like a monkey with glasses. Really shocking to read that. And that, of course, is the reason. That's what, if I was getting that at the age of 12 or 13, why would I, open up an investigation into these matters and what we did around the world? So how would I teach it? I would teach matters of enslavement and colony just as the Germans teach the Holocaust today. I would make it compulsory. I would take kids to visit some of the places where enslaved people were brought. I put it on a par with aspects of the horrors that have been perpetrated in later generations. And I realized I knew nothing about this. The scales fell from my eyes only very recently, only in the last decade, as I got into this story and I began to see the specifics, the particularities, the details, and met people who were descendants of enslaved people who carried this legacy with them. So I think we just need a root and branch transformation. I think we need to teach our kids who we are, what we have been capable of in the past, and what we intend to do about it in the future. And Britain is not ready to take responsibility and is not ready to apologize and is not ready to make reparation for horrors that lasted decades, if not centuries. So I would go very far and very deep. I mean, with the current regime in power here, that's of course unlikely to happen. And the politics against it will be very strong because in large part we have a media that is marshaled against such a line. But I think our failure to come to terms with our past is the reason that we are where we are now, on the cusp of catastrophe, with a country that I think many people see right now as basically falling apart.
So, I mean, this is really where I want to sort of bring us to or begin to sort of come to a close, come to a conclusion here. But sticking with education, I mean, I think, the idea of decolonizing the teaching of literature, the practice and the study of literary criticism is something that we take very seriously within the Institute of Irish Studies, within the Department of English at Liverpool. It's perhaps too late in the day to introduce the notion of a decolonized curriculum, and I entirely agree with you that it needs to start much sooner, and it needs to be something that is supported and driven within state education, and to sort of coming from the centre as far as sort of designing how these things might be taught goes. But when I was listening to the lecture, what I felt very strongly was that the selection of poems that complemented what you were saying, that were read so beautifully by Justine, were proof of what a decolonized literature might read and sound and look like. This was sort of reading across time and space as a way of, I suppose, pressing upon, if not understanding, why people are as they are, and why the world is as it is. And so we had poems. We had Heaney's work, of course, from the Republic of Conscience and the closing chorus of the Curate Troy. Two extraordinary poems by Ivan Boland, Witness and In Our Own Country. And then a poem that I'd never heard before by a poet who I've never heard before, Laguna Grande, by Chilean poet Mariana Camelio. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the selection process and why it was those poems that were read that evening.
Yes, well, I was thrilled and anxious to select 5 poems in such company and such a distinguished family. But my task was made a little easier because I was told that it was traditional to open and close with poems by Seamus Heaney, and I was entirely comfortable with that. And we worked together to choose ones that were relevant for the lecture that I was going to give. So it was then for me to fill in 3 poems in the middle, if you like, and we interspersed the lecture with poems. So I've only recently come across the writings of Evan Boland, and they've left a very deep impression. Evan Boland, who very recently passed away just in the last year or so, was a poet whose name I knew. I had come across 1 or 2 of her poems, but it was only in writing The Last Colony that I chanced across the happy coincidence that her father, Frederick Boland, an Irish diplomat, was in New York in 1960 and was the diplomat who oversaw the adoption of the famous UN General Assembly resolution 1514, on the right to self-determination, the right of all peoples to determine for themselves the conditions under which they would live. Frederick Boland presided the General Assembly and brought the gavel down on the adoption of that resolution. And it was that resolution which caused Mauritius and the Chagossians to win their case at the International Court of Justice. So, of course, that made me even more interested in Frederick Boland's daughter, Evan Boland, who becomes a poet, a remarkable poet, and who writes about colonialism. I mean, so much of her writing is infused by this instinct of the experiences that her forebears will have gone through and still go, and she still goes through, living in a divided island today. So even Boland made a lot of sense. As for the 5th poem, this was a curious story. I had just come back from Chile. I'm writing the 3rd book now in the trilogy, East-West Street, The Rat Line, and the 3rd one, which is connected to the first 2, concerns the lives of a couple of men, Augusto Pinochet, former dictator of Chile, and Walter Rauff, inventor of the mobile gas chamber, friend of Otto Wächter, who's the main character in my 2nd book, The Rat Line. And they get to know each other in Ecuador and in Chile. And Ralph, in fact, ends up living in the small town of Punta Arenas, deep in southern Chile. And I had just come back from Punta Arenas looking for the ghosts of Walter Ralph. Met many people who knew him, who remembered him, who knew exactly what he had done. He was the manager of a fish cannery that actually put the flesh of crabs, giant spider crabs, into tins called centolla in Chile. And that fishery was called the Pesquera Camelio. And by extraordinary coincidence, the granddaughter of the founder and owner of the Pesquera was a poet, and a very, very good poet, Mariana Camelio. I was introduced to her work by a Chilean friend of mine, Rodrigo Rojas, also a poet and a writer. And her poetry touched me very much, not least because it evoked, she lives in Punta Arenas, the place, the atmosphere, the crabs, the work, and so on and so forth. And so I thought it would be very good to include one of her poems in the readings. I think she was rather pleased because it is something of an honor to be included in a sort of a spoken anthology alongside Evan Boland and Seamus Heaney. I've never met Mariana Camellia. We've communicated and conversed. She seems like a very interesting person, but I thought it would be interesting to introduce into the evening a link with the next thing that I was writing. I mean, in a sense, that is sort of the story of my life and how I do things, how things are connected in the most curious and unexpected ways, through law, through writing, through travel. One thing leads to another. You open one door, you find yourself in a space, And then there are three more doors, and you've got to go through each of them. And so, in this curious way, the Last Colony and Seamus Heaney and Mariana Camelio are all connected through this strange process of law and literature that I've found myself immersed in. And I think it was that, amongst other things, the choice of 5 poems in this way that made it, in part, such a special evening for me. It was unexpected. I must say, when I was first asked to choose poems, I thought, oh my word, this is going to be very onerous and very difficult. But in fact, it wasn't. They sort of chose themselves because they were so closely connected to the story that I was telling. And so I think the poems, which were so beautifully read by Justine Mitchell, I mean, just spectacular, brought the whole thing together. It was the poems that made the evening so incredibly special. I think the audience, which was a wonderful audience, you could feel the tension of the audience. I mean, you know when you've got a room, you know when you've lost a room, and that room was connected. There was no question. But they understood the choice of the poems, and that was a thrill, and that was exciting. It was wonderful. It was absolutely a wonderful evening for me.
This is really the ideal place to end, with these connections across time and space, as I've suggested, and you in turn have suggested a project for us, this idea of the spoken anthology of the poems that are read during these annual Seamus Heaney lectures. We should think as an institute about, in some way, creating a list of the poems that are read, and sharing that with people, so that they have a resource to go back to, and these are treasured in their own way, these poems in this context. Philippe Sands, thank you so much for speaking to me this afternoon. It's a great honour for me, myself. It's a great honour for the Institute, and your generosity means a great deal. Thank you.
Well, Eleanor, you're a very, very generous person. I think the honour was mine. I loved being in Liverpool. It's firstly a wonderful city, and I don't go nearly enough. But also, when you asked back then a few weeks ago, would I be willing to do this? Of course, thrilled to do this, because it's a way of continuing and extending what was a really special experience for me. I mean, honestly, it's not just me saying, oh, yeah, it was a great evening, everything. That was a special evening that I really cherish. Thank you so much for inviting me on this continuation of that evening. I really appreciate it.